Melissa.
Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Exploring the Latest Community Foundation Snapshot, highlighting fiscal year 23 annual CF Insights Survey Analysis. We will begin shortly. A few reminders for today's event. This event is being recorded and will be shared on the events page, as well as shared directly with all registrants. So if you miss anything, feel free to watch the recording. The Q&A will be available to allow your questions. You can upvote and comment on questions as well. So we encourage you to submit those as along today's presentation. And the live transcript is available if you select show subtitles or view full transcript. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to webinars@cof.org. We'll be happy to assist you. And as a courtesy, if you have any AI meeting note takers, we just ask that you disable them, just so we can encourage a full engaged conversation today. At this time, I will hand it over to Dave Rosado, the Council's Senior Advisor for Community Philanthropy.
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dave Rosado, Senior Advisor for Community Philanthropy at the Council on Foundations. I'm going to be joined a little bit later by Courtney Bankson, the Chief Strategy Officer at the Wichita Foundation. But first, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off by giving just a brief background of CF Insights and what it is, who it's for, and talk a little bit about the annual survey before we dig into the latest data snapshot looking at 2023. For those of you who are longtime users or fans of CF Insights, thank you for joining us for this new conversation about the 2023 data. For anybody who's coming into this for the first time, I hope a little bit of this background is going to be useful for you. As Melissa mentioned, Q&A is open, so absolutely feel free to ask any questions that you might have. So with that, just give a quick background on CF Insights. CF Insights is a data platform that is hosted by the Council on Foundations to provide community foundations across the country with a way to compare their operations and organizational health, performance, and sustainability to peers of their choosing. To be able to provide rich data through the report I'm going to be reviewing today and through the benchmarking tool itself, which I'll spend a few minutes demonstrating a little bit later, we invite community foundations across the country to participate in what we call our CF Insights annual survey. This survey tracks field-wide growth trends and some of the key differences between community foundations of different sizes. It's mainly, but not entirely, focused on and driven by financial metrics like asset mix by product, and by product I mean different fund types like donor advised funds, field of interest, scholarships, unrestricted funds, everything in between, grant making by product, operating revenues, operating reserves, operating expenses, the different types of software systems different community foundations use to process gifts or grants or for general accounting purposes, and a whole lot of other data points as well. And I'll give a little bit of a better idea of what kinds of data are available in the benchmarking tool in just a little bit. This annual survey, the findings for which we're going to be talking about starting with the next slide, was previously known as the Columbus Survey, as it was when the Columbus Foundation, which makes sense, worked to collect this data for about 20 years before it moved over to CF Insights, where it's been hosted since. So with that, let's go ahead and dig into some of the latest data from 2023. And let's start by looking at the sample that's included in this snapshot. Let me start before going into the key takeaways from the survey, the major headlines, with a quick update on this that I'm really excited to share. And for anybody who might have already seen the results online, you might have seen this already. But this year, for the first time, in addition to the self-reported data that we've gotten from roughly 200 community foundations who participated in our survey, we have now been also been able to include supplemental 990 data from hundreds more community foundations for a total of 612 in our big sample, thanks to our friends at Candid. Now, with this much larger data set, we can show a much more comprehensive snapshot of the overall makeup of the field, the overall snapshot of the field standing as it was in 2023, and highlight some of the growth trends that we're going to be focusing on today. One thing I'll mention here, and I'll reiterate as we move through the slides, and especially when we get to the benchmarking tool, that 990 data helps us create this overall snapshot, as I mentioned, right, of assets, gifts, and grants, and donor advised fund activity as well. But some of the more detailed metrics that we're going to be talking about that really dig into how it is that community foundations operate and how they're staffed, how many donors they work with, and all of those other different data points. As you might know, are not going to be things that you find on the 990. So it's still super important for individual community foundations to sign on and share their data with us as part of this survey. And this will be something that I'll be sure to repeat near the end of today's webinar. But let's first take a step back and start with the larger data sample. So the 612, and I'm going to use laser pointer here to guide us around. But one of the things that might jump out to you is that the Midwest has a whole lot of community foundations. A little bit less than half of the community foundations, at least out of the 612, which is not all of the community foundations in the country, but is roughly 2/3 of them. Half of these happen to be in the Midwest. Um, that is in no small part due to how many community foundations happen to be in Indiana, which has 92, 93 counties and a community foundation for every county within the state, plus 200-ish other community foundations that happen to be in other Midwestern states. Um, a lot of those Indiana-based community foundations and many other community foundations across the country also happen to be relatively small. And that's when I'll be, asking you to look at the chart on the right-hand side of the slide, where you can see that roughly half of the community foundations out of the 612 manage less than $50 million in assets or less. So about half of this field here that are on the smaller side. And that's something that we're going to get back to a little bit later as well. Those 612 community foundations held about $152.4 billion in assets in 2023. And this is going to be where I do a little bit of zooming in and out to the more detailed sample that participated in the survey. Because what we want to be able to do when talking about growth trends is look at the community foundations for whom we have the last 2 years of data. So all of the 612 community foundations collectively held $152.4 billion in 2023. We have data for 2022 and 2023 for 228 of those community foundations. And hopefully that number goes up as we continue to hopefully have supplemental 998 data again next year. But looking at the community foundations for whom we have data for the past 2 years, nearly 90%, I think it's 88 or 89% of the community foundations in that 228 sample experienced some level of asset growth in that time. So year-over-year asset growth from 22 to 23 among 90% of the community foundations in the sample for whom we have 2 years of data. One of the things we're going to see on the next couple of slides is that this wasn't necessarily due to high levels of fundraising activity by community foundations, but was a reflection of more positive market conditions at the time in 2023 and some of the more positive investment returns that community foundations were able to leverage to increase their assets. In 2023, fundraising among community foundations remained effectively flat. The median community foundation with data for both years showed a 3% decrease from 2022 to 2023. And yes, that total fundraising for all of the community foundations in our set happens to be quite high, right? It's $16.2 billion. That's a high dollar amount. Not as high as the grant making total from 2023, $18.7 billion. Um, the median community foundation mobilized more resources into their communities in 23 than they did in 2022. The median community foundation increased their grant making total by 10%. So again, fundraising stayed effectively flat. The median community foundation saw a 3% decrease. So more than half of the community foundations for whom we have 2 years of data saw their fundraising total decrease in 2023 from what it was in 2022. And the median community foundation increased their grant making total by 10%. So more than half of the community foundations in our sample increased their grant making total by double digits. And one of the things that I'm going to mention here too, which might occur to you as you're just taking a look at these two numbers, is that grant making exceeded fundraising in 2023. Now, what's interesting about that is that CF Insights has been reporting on this data since 2008. And this is the first time in that many years, 2008 to 2023, that grant making exceeded fundraising for the sample of community foundations that we have data for. And we're going to see that again here, or on the next slide rather. What we're going to do now is zoom way in on the 100 largest community foundations by asset size over the last 10 years. And the reason we do this, the reason we zoom in on a particular segment of the field is because this 100 community foundation sample happens to manage and kind of move resources that are about 90% of all of the funds that are held among community foundations in the United States. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the smaller sample is a consistent one, so it can allow us to track long-term trends among the 100. So this is the same 100 community foundations over this 10-year period. So as with the broader sample, these community foundations saw their assets grow in 2023. As I mentioned already, that's thanks in significant part to, at the time, improving market conditions and the positive investment returns of any invested assets. As we'll see on this slide, this is also reflecting what we were seeing in the broader sample. So let me first say, I talked last year about how 2020 and especially 2021, I'll use the laser pointer here again, represented moments in time in which many were energized to support their respective community foundation. This was a segment of the field that were among the most significant actors during the COVID pandemic. Community foundations are among the most and most significant philanthropic entities to respond and act in the wake of disasters that may affect their communities, right? Mass casualty events. The COVID pandemic was something that the entire field experienced, right, at the same time. And so community foundation fundraising saw a massive jump in 2020 rather, and an even more massive jump in 2021. So in 2022, you do see a decrease here that still kept fundraising totals well above what they were in 2020. But now for the second straight year, there were some declines in fundraising across the field for a total that's returned basically to what they were in 2020, right when the pandemic was emerging. Now, grant making continues to climb, and that has been the case basically since 2014, other than for a little bit of a dip in 2019. So increases for 5 consecutive years, a slight dip in 2019, and then significant increases at a faster rate than it was before even. The new high for this sample is 16 billion for the 100 community foundations, right? So 16 billion in giving by the 100 largest community foundations in the country. And this visual really says it all, because if you look at the fundraising, that's the blue bar, and as it is related to the grant making, that's the green bar, it's always been a little bit above the grant making, right? They more or less stay at the same distance from each other with the fundraising exceeding grant making by roughly the same amount every single year up until 2021 when fundraising really jumped up. Now they kind of go back to the relationship that they had for all of these previous years, and then in 2023 they flip for the first time. So grant making exceeding fundraising for the top 100, largest 100 community foundations, as we saw for the collective field. Now, as is always the case, and here we're looking at donor advised funds specifically. So donor advised fund assets, gifts, and grants, these are their collective uh, DAF assets, DAF fundraising, DAF grant making for our sample here. So a little bit less than 500 community foundations in this chart here. Donor advised funds represent a significant portion of fund activity among community foundations, representing about 30% of all the assets that were held by the sample. Um, a little bit less than half, 47% of all gifts coming into community foundations came into a DAF, and more than half, 57% of all grant dollars that went on into communities came from a DAF at a community foundation. So clearly, DAF holders continue to activate their funds, moving significant dollars to causes, organizations, and to communities that they may be supporting. And those are some of the key headlines from the annual survey, really just kind of scratching the surface of all of the data that's available on our latest snapshot report. So from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about a few comps, a few comparisons between community foundations of different size cohorts to show how their operations may differ. And this is something that we provide every year through our annual CF Insights survey snapshot. And these are all an illustration of the additional level of detail that we're able to put together that says more about how community foundations who participate in our survey, that give us more detail than the 990s might have, tell us more about how they operate. So here's the first one. We're looking here at two different data points. One is funds per full-time equivalent. That is the light blue bars on this slide. This shows the number of funds, the median community foundation in each asset size cohort, right? These blue bars here. How many funds per staff person, per full-time equivalent they have in their portfolio. This is a good, not perfect, but a good way to gauge how much available capacity your team might have to take on additional funds or to grow your donor portfolio. Now, the higher the number that is, and this is a little bit simplified, and I'll get to why in a second. The higher the number is, the more likely it is that your staff might have limited capacity to maintain high or expected levels of service to your donors if you continue to grow your donor portfolios without adding headcount. So if you keep the size of your staff the same, keep increasing the number of donors that you have, you're going to have more funds per full-time equivalent at your community foundation, which makes sense, right? But this is a good way to kind of compare where you are relative to peers if you understand how high touch or not the donors that you work with are as compared to the peers donors are, right? So you want to have a little bit more context behind what types of services, what types of donor relationships your peers might maintain. And then once you understand that sort of more apples to apples comparison, how that number might compare for your community foundation to your peers' metrics in terms of funds per full-time equivalent. Either way, it does provide a gut check to know how close or not you might be to peers, or to the median community foundation in your asset size cohort. Now, the dark blue bars are going to be a little bit more straightforward because it just shows the median number of full-time equivalents for each cohort, right? So the number of staff roughly for each for each cohort, the median community foundation in each cohort. Now, unsurprisingly, as asset size increases, you're going to see that the headcounts increase as well. Larger community foundations may add specialized staff, specialized teams to serve different functions or lead community leadership efforts that they're investing in. Those are obviously not exclusive to larger peers, but they will have additional resources to continue to invest in specialized staff to work in some of these areas. But if you think back to the one of the earlier slides that I showed, roughly half of the field, right? Less than $50 million in assets. Now, we don't have staff numbers on all, whatever it was, 300 of those community foundations, but it's pretty safe to assume that a good chunk of those are going to have around the same number of full-time equivalents as the median foundation does in this sample. So small but mighty community foundations working with relatively fewer resources, doing really important work in their communities. And then, as you see, with the more resources comes more ability to invest in additional staff and things like that. Here's a look at revenue mix by asset size cohort. There's a lot of colors here and a lot of data points here, but the main two data points that I want to highlight are that there are just two. So let's start with the purple wedge here in this donut chart. As community foundation asset size increases, right? So these are the smallest ones, and then they get bigger from left to right on the top row, and then even more so on the bottom row. You could see that that purple wedge starts to starts to shrink really when you get down or go beyond $50 million in assets. These are community foundations that are looking to grow, looking to remain sustainable over the long term. So they might depend a little bit more on direct fundraising from individuals to help support their operations than larger community foundations, where you're going to see the green wedge, that's fee for service revenue, start to grow. That green wedge right here. It's not a significant amount, but you can see it start to grow when you get really beyond 250. And then you could see that it almost cracks 5% among the largest community foundations, $500 million and above. The larger community foundations just more likely to either to do a couple of things. They might fundraise for specific initiatives, or they might develop other earned revenue streams. So it could be philanthropic advising for private foundations or back office for supports for other organizations, fee-for-service offerings that are along the lines of capacity building or trainings for nonprofits in their area, those kinds of things, event space rental, and those kinds of offerings that a community foundation might be able to earn additional earned revenue from. And here's the last comparison here by community foundation size. This is looking at the median for each asset size cohort. Again, median for each cohort. The median operating reserve to budget ratio. So the conventional wisdom here, when you're thinking about the size of an operating reserve and how large you might want to maintain that reserve, right? The conventional wisdom is that you want your reserves to be able to cover roughly 6 months of operations, right? If needed. So to sort of simplify that for this chart, you want to basically hit 50%. And the median for every cohort, except 250 to 500, but they're pretty close, 47%, are at 50% or more. So their operating reserve basically is about half the size of their annual budget. If you take the median for all community foundations that reported their operating reserve data for 2023, that median is 8 months of cash. So the median community foundation has 8 months of cash in reserve. So this is a look at some of the top line headlines from the annual survey and some of the comparisons that we're able to create using some of the benchmarking data that we collect through the survey as well. Now, if you've already explored the annual survey results on the website and you clicked around and you saw some of the data points, and even going back through some of these slides, you're going to see that a lot of those data points are aggregated, right? So there's medians, there's averages, there's collective sample data for all 600 or 500 community foundations, depending on the data point. But you might be interested in seeing how you compare with individual community foundations, right? So there might be peers that are more relevant to you than the broader sample, and you want to be able to find the ones that are most similar to you in terms of the way you operate, or the ones that are aspirational to you in some way. They might be structured in a way that you want to get to within some period of time. To access that level of detail, we offer what we call a plus membership for community foundations. So council members that are community foundations have the option to upgrade their membership to a plus membership, and it gives you direct access to roughly 200 different data points on hundreds of community foundation peers, going back all the way to 2008, 2007. And you can run longitudinal reports or peer reports or visual reports that compare you with your peers in that many data points, around 200. So expense to asset ratio and revenue mix and staff to non-staff costs and operating reserve and the software that you use and funds per FTE, FTEs by functional area, so how many finance staff, donor relations staff, et cetera. Those are all the types of data points that you would be able to access on individual community foundations by name that you can compare yourselves to. Now the snapshot, I will say, as I'm going to do a little bit of a transition here and switch to a browser window, the snapshot does offer some disaggregated data on some data points, but this is the only way to see all of the data points that we have available on the CF Insights website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen one more time. And in so doing, I'm going to switch to a browser window. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Should be still loading, maybe. Okay, perfect. All right. So right now we're on the CF Insights database and we're on the benchmarking page. So I'm going to show you how it looks to create a peer group. I'm going to show you how it looks to generate a downloadable data report, and I'm going to show you what it looks like to generate a few visual reports during this demonstration. It'll be fairly quick here, but I'm going to give you an idea of how it all works. So on the benchmarking page, you can create a new peer group by just clicking the new peer group button. You can name it whatever you want. What I will say here is that there is no limit if you are a plus member of the council, no limit to the number of peer groups that you can create, and peer groups are saved at the organizational level. So if you create a peer group as somebody at the foundation and you happen to leave that role, and somebody else creates a new account at the same community foundation, they will see the peer groups that you've created. So this, that sort of counteracts any issue with turnover at a community foundation, where all of the peer groups are going to be saved at the org level, and you can create as many peer groups as you want. Once you name your peer group, whatever it is you might want to name it, you will add characteristics. And the characteristics, if anybody you run, if you're familiar with a Boolean search, any kind of Boolean logic, it's pretty much the same. So you're going to define your characteristic, and then you're going to apply an operator and a value to that, and it's going to show you the community foundations that meet that criteria that you just added in there. So let me start by clicking characteristic, and I'm going to scroll down fairly quickly on purpose, just to kind of illustrate how many data points happen to be here. But what we've built into this is that you can actually type in whatever data point you might want, right? So you don't have to go scrolling up and down this massive list to look for the data point that you might want. So I'm going to click survey year. I'm going to only look for community foundations that have given us data for 2023. And I'm going to look for community foundations that have assets of between 150 and 300 $300 million in assets. Okay, so we have 2023 data. The foundations also have 150 or more. Actually, it's more than 150. So if somebody has exactly $150 million, they will not be included. So you might want to put like 1499999. And community foundations whose assets are less than 300 million. Once you're done adding your characteristics, and I should mention here, you could add 50 characteristics as you want. It's a good idea in general to start pretty broad and go from there. You're going to click show results, and it's going to generate this table of foundations that meet those criteria. And we have 22 to start with, right? So if you want to continue to add data points, columns, but you don't want to filter them out, what you're going to do here is you're going to click metrics, and you're going to add other columns of data to your table so that you can see some additional details on the peer group that you created without adding these as filters, right? Because if you add them as filters, you kind of got to know, roughly how many staff all your peers have, and then you might accidentally leave one out if you say above 5 staff or below 50 staff or whatever. And there are ways around that, but this is a much easier way to work with it. So let's start with region, state, the size of the population of the area served. Let's add in donor advised fund assets and expense to asset ratio, FTE total, and I'll just click one at random here, urban or rural, and let's click apply. And you're going to see near instantly how this generates that table. All of those data points are now, all those data points are now added in on the 22. And you can see all of those additional details. Okay. You can continue to add additional metrics. You can export this to an Excel and work with the data offline. You can save your work so that you can come back here, select your peer group from this dropdown, and load it again. I always recommend doing that. Save early and often. And if you want to generate some charts there aren't that many charts, but they're helpful because they combine a lot of data points into one visual. You can load some of these charts and look at how you compare with your peers by assets by product, right? So this just takes all of their asset information by product by fund type and compares you with your peers. If you want to see the details, you could export the data into an Excel. That button is right there. You can track longitudinally how fast or not your community foundation is growing compared to peers. Same with fundraising and some of the other data points that we spoke about in the earlier part of the presentation. Funds per FTE, right? And now you can see, as of whatever year we might be talking about, the individual community foundation and that metric for that year, and you can export the data into an Excel file. All of the charts data are available up here as well. So you can click metrics and you can look for funds per FTE. You can look for other years of data. It's all available to you and it's all there to download. There's no limits on the number of downloads, peer groups, anything like that. Number of users at the foundation. So everybody at the foundation can have their own login. And that is a quick demonstration of how the benchmarking tool works. So what I'll do here is I'm going to stop sharing. And I think this might be a good time to bring in Courtney Bengtson. See. All right. Excellent, thanks. Well, just a quick introduction to Courtney, Chief Strategy Officer at the Wichita Foundation. Since joining Wichita Foundation in 2013, she's been working on strategy and investment opportunities to support the foundation's goals. As Chief Strategy Officer, she articulates the foundation's vision while leading its growth initiatives. Courtney chairs the Leadership Wichita Board of Trustees, leads the ConLab School Wichita's advisory board, and serves on the Community Foundation Advisory Group at the Council on Foundations. So have the pleasure and honor of interacting with Courtney on a regular basis. So Courtney, thank you so much for joining us. What I want to do first, before we go too much further, is would just love it if you can share a few top level facts about the Wichita Foundation, just in terms of who you serve, asset size and mix, average grant making, anything else that we should know about the Wichita Foundation.
Sure. Well, thanks, Dave. Happy to be here. Happy to share our experience with CF Insights. So the Wichita Foundation will celebrate its 40th anniversary this coming year. So we've been in the Wichita area for quite some time. If you're not familiar with our location in terms of Kansas, we're pretty close to right smack in the middle, about a couple of hours south of right in the middle of the United States. Wichita is a MSA of about 800,000, so we're considered a mid-sized community. We have really made it a point to focus less on our assets under management and more on the capital that we're deploying into the community. So always want to lead with that. And saying that we're nearing about $10 million in capital deployment this fiscal year. We're at June 30 end. So we're getting very close and hopeful to meet that goal soon. When I started at the foundation about 12 years ago, we were grant making about $4 million a year. And since then we've started looking at our grant making, and we've also started an impact investment program. So we're doing that. We do manage about 115 million in assets, but we've really been in a growth pattern, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit, Dave, when we talk about some of the data that Insights has provided us.
Wonderful, thank you, Courtney. And yeah, I think speaking of the data, the Wichita Foundation signed up to access the platform for the first time last year, I think after participating in the survey for a long time. So a lot of your data was already in there. I think before we even transition into how you've used the data and maybe what action steps it went to inform, could you just describe or talk a little bit to the conversations you were having internally at the foundation? What some of the questions were that you were looking to answer for yourselves, and yeah, but just basically what led you to become curious about getting access to CF Insights?
Yeah, so we have for many years participated in the survey, like you said, but we really weren't, I don't think, capitalizing on the comparable information that we could have. And luckily, my relationship with the council has grown since I do serve on the advisory board that you mentioned, and so kind of got a little bit more insight into what it would be like if we were a Plus member and what CF Insights could provide us. So as we're thinking about the growth of our organization and how we want to affect our community, we oftentimes, when we're proposing potential operational, significant operational changes, as we're discussing with either committees or board members, the question is always, well, how does this compare to other community foundations of our size, of our geographic area, et cetera? And so we were asking questions internally about things like, how are our fees structured in comparison to others? What does our staff size look like? How much should we be deploying on an annual basis? Are we, the benchmarking piece of that is really important to be able to compare. And I think that was really the attractive point to us, to be able to have some of those peer communities to look towards.
Great, thank you. And once you gain access to the data, we worked, this was, I think it was last fall, if I remember correctly. We worked with you to put together, a relevant peer group that we would ultimately use their data to put together a dashboard of comparison reports with Wichita. So I would love to know the characteristics that you were looking for. So who were you looking for in a peer group to make sure that you were seeing data on a relevant set of community foundations to compare yourselves to?
Yeah, so one thing that I kind of mentioned when I was giving kind of the overview of the Wichita Foundation is that, yes, we want to be able to compare asset size in terms of investment returns, et cetera, but we also wanted to look at other things. So whether it was geographic size, we particularly were looking at trying to make the case, and I kind of mentioned this already, but making the case for adding additional capacity internally, and needed some clear benchmark understanding of where we sat in that arena with our peers. And then also just, it's really easy as a mid-sized organization to get caught up in looking at some of the larger community foundations in the country and really aspiring to be like them, but then also realizing that there are some capabilities that we don't have because we don't have the amount of assets, the amount of grant making dollars. And so how do we find those organizations that are like-minded and that we can really learn from and teach lessons to, and really create sort of a peer partnership that's really important. And what actually happened from that is one of our peers that came up on our dashboard happens to only be about 45 minutes away from us, Hutchinson Community Foundation. And we do utilize them as a great thought partner, but it was really great to see them kind of pop up on the list as a comparable, because then we were able to compare more data than we realized.
That's really great. Yeah, and what we hope to do is to be able to create new connections and kind of deepen existing ones among peers that that might be like each other in ways that might be unexpected when they see the data. So I think in that spirit, would just love to know what your initial reaction was once we did deliver that dashboard, and whether or not there were any kinds of aha moments or surprising elements to the data that kind of jumped out to you, and what your reaction was to that.
I would say, again, we look towards aspirational foundations that we want to emulate certain behaviors from. And in some cases, those people showed up on our comparable dashboard. So in some ways it was like, okay, we are moving in the right direction. But again, there were some things that we saw, our grant making lined up pretty evenly with many of our peers, but our contributions were towards the lower end. And so gives us an opportunity to say, if we want to continue to grow this pattern of capital deployment, we've got to bring in additional dollars to be able to do that work. So that's just one small example.
Well, that's great. So I think that's a great segue into my next question, which is to maybe speak to some of the other examples of action steps that you took informed by the data, and whether or not it's informed any particular changes to the way that the foundation operates.
Yeah, so two particular ones that I think really stand out for me that are very recent. One was, and I mentioned a bit about this earlier, is the idea of additional staff capacity for some of the work that we're doing. So we've really been in a growth pattern for many, many years. When I joined the foundation, there were 4 of us. And then this year we've continually added, but right now we're at 9 staff. That is still based off of our asset size and deployment below what our average peer might look like. But we did add 3 brand new positions this last fiscal year. So prior to that, we were much smaller in terms of what it looked like to be able to do this work. So we were able to utilize the data to make the case for some increased capacity that we knew we needed, but it gave us an opportunity to really, match us up with people who are recognizable in the field and say that, as we're trying to get to this level, we need to, again, increase our capacity. So we did, we increased 50% of our staff within a 3-4 month time period, which has its own challenges, right? In terms of growing pains, but we're thrilled to continue to grow internally to do that work. And then the other one that we just recently did was compared our administrative fees with our peers to see if we were in line with where we were at. We haven't raised our administrative fees for many years. And so we were able to really do a deep dive into where we're at, how we think about revenue diversification beyond administrative fees. And we're able to see kind of what trends there are and how people are allocating for those things themselves. And so we're continuing to look at that, but I think it was really helpful for us to see that we were pretty much middle of the road on our administrative fees, but that we probably have some more opportunity to diversify some of that revenue with some other fee-for-service things.
That's great. And I think on the topic of just kind of opportunities that can be uncovered here, are there any new questions that are arising for you all now that, it sounds like you made a pretty major change, increasing your staff by that much, and are now thinking about the future? So we'd just love to know, what are some new questions that are coming up? What would you be looking to learn over the next maybe year or longer?
Yeah, so to piggyback off what I just said, the fee-for-service is really appealing to us, and to figure out what lane we can play in, looking at how other people are setting that up for success in their organizations. And then I think too, impact investment is something we've started and we're really interested in, but we're trying to figure out what our next sort of move on that is, and how we really capitalize on that as a potential opportunity for us, and know that there are others in the field doing that. And so it's great to have the connections and the opportunity to know who's involved in that work and who we can reach out to.
Well, this is really great, Courtney. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about Wichita Foundation's experience with the data. And I think, this is a good time for us to move into a little bit of Q&A. Would love it if you could stay a few more minutes in case any questions come your way as well. Absolutely feel free to share your questions in the Q&A box. And I see that we do have a few here to address right off the top. So I'll read them out loud and address them, or pass them to Courtney if they're for you. All right, so quick question about the survey, more of a clarifying question. So the first one is the survey data combined fiscal and calendar years 2023? That's a really good question. The way that the survey data is compiled is we base it on the fiscal year. A lot of community foundations do operate on a calendar year, but there is a not insignificant number of community foundations that operate on a mid-year fiscal, or March 31st or April 30th or what have you. So it is a little bit of a hybrid there. So it's all based on fiscal years. I see that there is another sort of related question to this, just to kind of clarify with the benchmarking piece. If you can choose a fiscal year end metric, so can you compare your foundation only to those that have the same fiscal year end that you have, by looking at only those with the June 30th, only those with calendar year fiscal? And yes, absolutely. One of the limitations currently of the snapshot is that we do kind of put everybody together in the visuals. Sometimes you will see, I don't think there was an appreciable difference this year, so I don't think you're going to see it in the narrative this time. But if there is an appreciable difference between mid-year and calendar year fiscal, I think last year is a good example of this. you'll see it in the narrative. So near any charts that speak to asset growth rate or anything like that, it'll be called out there and say, mid-year fiscal community foundation saw, a different growth rate because part of their fiscal year happened to be during a better, market environment or something like that. So we'll try and call that out. But yes, you can choose peers on that. And then do we have a chart of asset size breakdown? Sorry, by endowed and non-endowed assets. Yes. So this is actually going to have a two-part answer because on the snapshot, there is, if you go to the website, and I'll go back to my slides in just a second to give the URL and everything else. There is median breakdowns by asset size cohort between the proportion of endowed and non-endowed assets. So you do have that breakdown. In the benchmarking tool, you also have that, but we also have in addition to endowed and non-endowed, we also have quasi or board designated endowed funds. So you can see even more detail on the benchmarking tool. So yes, we do have that data. There's another one that just came in as I was speaking to that one. So let me read that out loud. Is fund per FTE based on total FTEs or just FTEs that provide donor services? Great question. The way it's presented is all FTEs, but we do have donor service FTEs available in the benchmarking. So if you want to isolate that, which is a very common request for reasons that might seem obvious, yes, you can just look at FTE per donor service. Sorry, fund per FTE donor service FTE. So yes. All right, that was a little bit of a rapid fire question and answer on data points in the snapshot and in the dashboard. I will wait maybe 10 seconds for anybody else to add another question. Any questions for Courtney? I did see one pass through, but I think it was answered by text. Yeah. All right. So there are no other questions coming in. What I will do is I will go back to my slide deck, and if any come in between now and the next, let's say, 5 minutes or so, happy to take those on. Absolutely. So let me do that first. And switching between a browser and let me see. Okay, so there was one that was coming in while I was setting up the screen share. So I will continue to set up the screen share and I'll answer this question. Can we see other people's benchmarks? There is no native, and sorry, this is not the slide I wanted to share. Okay. There is no native way to see how others have set up their peer groups. Part of the Plus membership, I will mention, is access to us as a team. So you heard from Melissa earlier, and you'll hear from her again to close this out, but she's part of the team. Our other colleague, Jess, is also here to help support. You could reach out to us and just ask, what is it that other people are doing in terms of the types of benchmarks they're putting together. Even though you won't be able to access them directly, we're more than happy to share that. And I would say that folks are very happy, more than happy to share that as well. They're not to steal Melissa's thunder, so I won't get into detail about it, but there is going to be a way for you to ask them directly. And so, we set up a way for you all to interact with each other and ask each other exactly those kinds of questions. One of the things I will mention, which I think is a good feedback opportunity, is we as admins have the opportunity to publish a peer group to everyone. And let me actually backtrack. It's not a peer group, it's publish a search to everyone. It'll be the same results to everyone, but it's not like we're going to make a static peer group of 5 community foundations that we select and then you have to see them. If we make a peer group, which is to say, foundations with, assets between 150 and $300 million with more than 5 FTEs, whatever, right? We have the ability to publish that search to everyone in the database, so everyone will have access to it. So if you think, and have it be sort of like a preset that gets saved above all of the ones that you create. If you have a peer group that you think would be interesting or helpful for everyone to have access to, please let us know. It's something that we can create and publish for everyone who's in the database. Accessible still to Plus members, but saves everyone from creating the same search if a lot of people sort of have the same question and want to create a peer group with those parameters. So I'm going to transition us to closing unless there are any other questions. I'm happy to check one last time before we close out. Here we go. Okay, we do have one more. Do we have a prepared summary of general data per asset size for 25 to 50 million, for example? So is there a snapshot report for different asset size cohorts? Sort of. If you go to the website, let me go to the slide here so you can peruse the findings, right? So cof.org/cfinsights, there's going to be a link to the results there. A lot of the data points do happen to be organized by cohort. So you can self-compile a lot of those data points and put them together into a slide or to some sort of offline report that you share internally. And it's going to get you a lot of the way there from, if you were doing the same manually on the benchmarking tool. So, a little bit of a manual process, but there's not that many data points on the snapshot. So it should give you a good idea of, headcounts and asset mix and endowed and non-endowed assets and revenue mix and operating budgets and things like that, all organized by asset size cohort. A lot of the visuals, the charts, you can display on the snapshot site as a data table. So you will be able to, just basically copy it right out into an Excel. And the other thing I'll mention is if you scroll to the bottom of any page on the snapshot report, you're going to see there's a footer with a link for you to download the spreadsheet with the data on that page, if that makes sense. So that is another way. It's going to have, all the asset size cohorts, all their different data points. And that actually would be a quicker way for you to compile some of that data. If you are interested in seeing a data point on a cohort that's not available on the snapshot, just send me an email. Maybe it's something we could provide to you. So let me transition to this, and then if we have time at the end, we'll take maybe another question or two. I want to be mindful of time. One of the things that we ask everybody to consider is when we put out our next call for data, looking for 2024 fiscal year data to contribute to these findings. You can go to data.cfinsights.org. If you have a cof.org login, which is to say if you've ever registered for a webinar or attended any event that's hosted by the council, you have a login to CF Insights. So if you're somebody who manages data at your community foundation, you could participate in the survey. I know I mentioned that we have this really large data set thanks to the candid data, the 990 data, but that's surface level data. All of the much more detailed information about how different community foundations operate and are staffed and sustain their work and everything else, that depends on the data that you contribute. So really important to help contribute. And then I had this up a little bit for a little bit already. So that's the URL. You can email cfinsights@cof.org to email basically me, Melissa, and Jess at the same time, or you can email me directly at my email at the bottom of the screen. So let me do one last check of questions. And then asset structure composition, asset mix comparison. Yes, so we do have that. That's in the benchmarking tool. There was one of the visual charts that I showed earlier. Well, if you create a peer group in the benchmarking tool, you can compare your asset composition down to designated agency funds, supporting organizations, fiscal sponsorships, scholarships, supporting organizations, all the other different fund types, and you can compare that with your peers as well. So yes, that is available. All right. Do we have any other questions coming in? I don't believe so. Just pausing for extra questions because we do have a little bit of time. We have an extra minute here. And I don't see any new questions coming in. No questions for me or Courtney. All right, so before I hand things off to Melissa, Courtney, I just wanted to thank you one more time for joining us. Really appreciate you popping on and chatting with us for a few minutes. We'll be in touch again soon, of course. Yeah, if folks have any other questions, do not hesitate to write to me or the team. We're more than happy to answer your question or connect you with somebody in this network, in this CF Insights community of folks sharing their data. we will happily connect you with somebody who can answer your question. So with that, what I'm going to do is share my screen one more time and pass things off to Melissa. Sorry, Melissa. Fun with sharing screen here. But I've got it. I've got it. All right. Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. We want to stay connected, and a couple ways to do so is that we invite you to attend our upcoming virtual events, which include Plus member peer connections. Dave mentioned that there will be an opportunity to share within your peers of the space uniquely designed for Plus members. The dates are listed on our screen. And in addition to reaching out to us anytime, we are offering CF Insight office hours as an opportunity for you to hop on and not have to schedule a call. You can just attend these that are open and to ask any and all questions, and also learn more from other people that might be asking questions as well. 24/7, we have our philanthropy exchange to connect with your peers. There's a specific exchange called Community Foundation Business Models. And within that space, you can learn more about how community foundations are using this data and how they can explore and advance their business models. So thank you again for attending today's webinar. We hope to see you soon, either at our virtual events or in Minneapolis at Leading Locally. Registration is still open, so we invite you to register if you haven't done so. Please reach out if you have any questions or if we can assist you or your team at any time. So with that, thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.